5, Pipi Goes to the Fair. It was a day of the fair in the little town. Once a year they had a fair, and on each occasion the children in the little town were wild with joy that anything so exciting could happen. The town did not look its usual self at all on this day. There were crowds jostling everywhere, flags were hoisted, and the marketplace was full of stalls where you could buy the most wonderful things. There was such a noise and such a commotion that it was quite a thrill just to walk about in the streets. Best of all, down by the toll gate, there was a big fairground with a merry-go-round and rifle ranges and a theatre and all sorts of amusements. A menagerie too. A menagerie with every kind of wild animal imaginable. Tigers and giant snakes and monkeys and sea lions. If you stood outside the menagerie, you could hear queerer growls and roars than you have ever heard in all your life. If you had any money, you could of course go in and see it all too. It was no wonder that Annika's hair ribbons seemed to quiver with excitement when she was dressed and ready in the morning of that day, or that Tommy nearly swallowed his breakfast whole in his haste. Tommy and Annika's mother asked her children if they would like to go to the fair with her. Tommy and Annika looked a little uncomfortable and said that if their mother did not mind, they would really rather go with Pipi. Because you see, explained Tommy to Annika as they shot through Vinicula's cottage garden gates, it's sure to be much more fun with Pipi. Annika agreed. Pipi was dressed and waiting for them in the centre of the kitchen. She had at last found her big cartwheel hat in the woodshed. I quite forgot that I'd used it for carrying wood the other day, she said, pulling the hat down over her eyes. Don't I look grand? Tommy and Annika had to admit that she did. Pipi had blackened her eyebrows with coal and painted her mouth and nails with red paint. She had put on a very grand long evening dress, which was cut so low at the back that her red bodice was showing. Her big black shoes could be seen below the hem, and they looked smarter than usual because she had tied the green bows onto them, which she only used on special occasions. I thought I ought to look a real lady when I'm going to the fair, she said, tripping along as daintily as anyone can in such large shoes. She held up the hem of her skirt and said at regular intervals in a voice which was quite different from her usual one, "Delightful! Delightful!" "What's delightful?" asked Tommy. "Me," said Pipi in a satisfied tone of voice. Tommy and Annika thought everything delightful on the day of the fair. It was delightful to mix with the crowds in the streets and to go from one stall to another in the market and look at all the things that were spread out. To celebrate, Pipi bought a red silk scarf for Annika, and Tommy received a peaked cap of a kind that he had always longed for, but which his mother did not want him to have. At another stall, Pipi bought 2 glass clocks. They were full of pink and white hundreds and thousands. "You are kind, Pipi," said Annika, hugging her clock. "Oh, yes, delightful," said Pipi. "Delightful," she said, holding up her skirt with an air of great elegance. A long stream of people was pouring down towards a toll gate. Pipi, Tommy and Annika followed. "What a lovely noise," said Tommy joyfully. The barrel organs were playing and the merry-go-round was spinning round. People shouted and laughed. Arrow shooting and china breaking were in full swing. At the rifle ranges, people jostled to show their skill at shooting. "I'd like to have a closer look at that," said Pipi, tugging Tommy and Annika with her to a rifle range. Just then, there was no one at the particular rifle range, and the woman who was in charge of handing out rifles and taking the money was rather cross. and 3 children were not what she would choose for customers. She took no notice of them at all. Pipi looked at the targets with interest. They consisted of 3 paper figures painted blue, and each had a face as round as a ball. In the middle of the face was a very red nose. The nose was the bullseye. If you could not manage to hit the nose, you should at least try to get somewhere near it. Shots that did not hit the face were not counted. By and by, the woman became annoyed at seeing the children standing there. She wanted customers who could shoot and pay. So, you're still hanging around, she said crossly. No, said Pipi seriously. We're sitting in a marketplace cracking nuts. What are you staring at? Said the woman still more crossly. Are you waiting for someone to come and shoot? No, said Pipi. We're waiting for you to start turning somersaults. However, at that moment, a customer came along. He was an impressive-looking man with a gold chain across his waistcoat. He took hold of a rifle and weighed it in his hand. I might as well fire a few rounds, he said, just to show you how it should be done. He looked round to see if he had an audience, but there was no one near except Pipi, Tommy and Annika. Watch me, children, he said, and I will give you a first lesson in the art of shooting. This is how it should be done. He lifted the rifle to his cheek and fired the first shot. It missed. The second shot also. The third and fourth missed too. The fifth hit one figure on the lower part of its chin. Rotten rifle, said the impressive-looking man, and threw down the weapon. Pipi picked it up and loaded it. You are clever, she said. Another time, I shall do exactly as you've taught us. Not like this. Bang, 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 bang. 5 shots that hit a paper figure bang in the middle of its nose. Pipi handed a gold coin to the woman and walked away. The merry-go-round was so splendid that Tommy and Annika caught their breath with delight when they saw it. There were black and white and brown wooden horses. They had real manes and looked almost alive. They had saddles and reins too. You could choose whichever horse you wanted. Pipi spent a whole gold coin on tickets. She got so many that there was hardly enough room for them in her big purse. If I'd given them another gold coin, they'd probably have given me the whole roundabout thing, she said to Tommy and Annika, who were waiting for her. Tommy chose a black horse and Annika a white one. Pipi sat Mr. Nelson on one of the black horses that looked very wild. Mr. Nelson immediately started to inspect its mane to see if it had fleas. Is Mr. Nelson going on the merry-go-round too? Asked Annika in surprise. Of course, said Pipi. If I'd thought of it, I would have bought my horse too. He could have done with a bit of fun. And a horse riding on a horse, that would have been something very special in the horse line. As for herself, Pipi leapt into the saddle of a brown horse, and a moment later the merry-go-round started off to the music of a barrel organ playing the tune, Do you remember childhood's happy days with its fun and laughter? Tommy and Annika both thought it was wonderful to go on a merry-go-round. Pipi looked pleased too. She stood on her head on the horse with her legs right up in the air. Her long evening dress fell down round her neck. All that the people standing round could see was a red bodice, a pair of green knickers, Pipi's long thin legs with one brown and one black stocking, and her big black shoes which waved playfully backwards and forwards. That's how it's done when a real lady goes on a merry-go-round, said Pipi when the first term was over. The children stayed a whole hour on the merry-go-round, but in the end Pipi felt quite cross-eyed and said that she saw 3 merry-go-rounds instead of 1. Then, it's difficult to know which to choose, she said, so I think we might as well go somewhere else. She had heaps of tickets left, and those she gave to some little children who were standing near and had not had a ride because they had no money for tickets. Outside a tent nearby, a man stood shouting, "Another performance starting in 5 minutes. You must not miss this unique drama, The Murder of the Countess Aurora, or Who is Creeping in the Bushes?" "If anyone's creeping in the bushes, we must find out who it is straight away," said Pipi to Tommy and Annika. "Let's go in." Pipi went up to the box office. "Can I go in half price if I promise to look with one eye only?" she inquired, with a sudden attack of economy. The ticket lady would not hear of it. "I don't see any bushes, and no one creeping in them either," said Pipi crossly when she and Tommy and Annika had placed themselves in the front row close to the curtain. "It hasn't started yet," said Tommy. At that moment, the curtain went up, and they could see the Countess Aurora pacing the floor of the stage, wringing her hands and looking very worried. Pipi followed it all with keen interest. "I think she's unhappy about something," she said to Tommy and Annika, "or else she's got a safety pin sticking into her." The Countess Aurora was unhappy. She raised her eyes to the ceiling and said in a plaintive voice, "Is there anyone so unhappy as I? My children have been taken from me. My husband has disappeared, and I myself am surrounded by scoundrels and bandits who want to kill me." "This is terrible to hear," said Pipi, and her eyes went rather red. "I wish I were dead already," cried the Countess Aurora. Then Pipi burst into a flood of tears. "Please don't say that," she sobbed. "Things will get better, you'll see. I'm sure the children will turn up. And perhaps you can have another husband. There are so many men in the world," she hiccuped between sobs. Then the theatre manager came up to Pipi. He was the man who had been standing outside the tent shouting, and said that if she did not stop all that noise, she would have to leave the theatre immediately. "I'll try," said Pipi, rubbing her eyes. It was a terribly exciting play. Tommy kept turning his cap round and inside out from sheer nervousness, and Annika's hands were clasped tight. Pipi's eyes were wet and did not leave the Countess Aurora for a minute. Things were going from bad to worse for the poor Countess. There she walked in the palace garden, suspecting nothing. Suddenly, there was a shriek. It came from Pipi. She had caught sight of a man behind a tree, and he was looking far from friendly. The Countess Aurora seemed to have noticed the rustling too, because she said in a frightened whisper, "Who is creeping in the bushes?" "I can tell you," said Pipi eagerly. "It's a sly, horrid man with a black moustache. Hide in the woodshed and lock the door, for goodness sake." Now, the theatre manager came up to Pipi and said that she must go at once. "And leave the Countess Aurora alone with that ruffian? You don't know me," said Pipi. On the stage, the play continued. Suddenly, the horrid man rushed out of the bushes and threw himself at the Countess Aurora. "Your last hour has come," he hissed between his teeth. "We'll see about that," said Pipi, taking a leap onto the stage. She seized the bandit round the waist and threw him into the audience. She was still weeping. "How could you?" she sobbed. "What have you got against the Countess, I'd like to know? Think of it. She's lost her husband and her children. She's quite alone." She went up to the Countess, who had collapsed on a garden seat. "You can come and live with me at Villicula Cottage if you like," she said soothingly. Sobbing loudly, Pipi stumbled out of the theatre, closely followed by Tommy and Annika, and by the theatre manager. He shook his fists at her. The people in the theatre, however, clapped their hands and thought it was a splendid performance. When they were outside, Pipi blew her nose loudly and said, My goodness, that was a sad affair. Let's do something to cheer ourselves up. The menagerie, said Tommy. We haven't been to the menagerie. So off they went. But first they visited a sandwich stall, where Pipi bought 6 sandwiches for each of them and 3 big bottles of fizzy lemonade. "'Cause crying always makes me hungry," said Pipi. In the menagerie, there were lots of interesting things to see. Elephants and 2 tigers in a cage and several sea lions who could play ball, a whole lot of monkeys and a hyena and 2 giant snakes. Pipi immediately took Mr. Nelson to the monkey cage to say, "How do you do?" to his relations. There sat a sad-looking old chimpanzee. "Now come on, Mr. Nelson," said Pipi. "Say how do you do nicely. I should think that's your grandfather's cousin's aunt's little 3rd cousin." Mr. Nelson raised his straw hat as politely as he could, but the chimpanzee could not be bothered to return his greeting. The 2 giant snakes were in a big box. Once an hour they were taken out of the box by the beautiful snake charmer called Mademoiselle Paula, who showed them on a platform. The children were in luck. A performance was just about to begin. Annika was very much afraid of snakes, so she took firm hold of Pipi's arm. Mademoiselle Paula lifted up one of the snakes, a big, horrible, ugly thing, and laid it round her neck like a fur. "It's a boa constrictor," whispered Pipi to Tommy and Annika. "I wonder what the other one is." She went to the box and lifted out the other snake. It was bigger and more horrible still. Pipi laid it round her neck, just as Mademoiselle Paula had done with the other. Everyone in the menagerie gave a shout of terror. Mademoiselle Paula threw her snake into the box and rushed forward to save Pipi from certain death. The noise made Pipi's snake frightened and angry. He could not understand at all why he should be hanging round the neck of a little red-haired girl instead of round Mademoiselle Paula's, which he was used to. He decided to give the red-haired girl something to remember, and he coiled his body round her in a grip which would have squeezed an ox to death. "Don't you try that old trick on me," said Pipi. "I've met bigger snakes than you know, in Indochina." She loosened the snake and put him back into his box. Tommy and Annika had turned pale. "That was a boa constrictor too," said Pipi, fastening one of her suspenders which had come undone. "Just what I thought." Mademoiselle Paula kept on scolding Pipi in some foreign language. Everyone in the menagerie heaved a deep sigh of relief, but they sighed too soon. This was obviously a day when anything might happen. Afterwards, no one knew how it occurred. The tigers had been fed with large chunks of red meat, and later the keeper swore that he had shut the door properly. But soon someone screamed in terror, "There's a tiger loose!" The yellow-striped brute lay curled up outside the menagerie, ready to spring. People fled in all directions, but one little girl was squeezed into a corner close to the tiger. "Don't move!" people shouted to her. They hoped the tiger would leave her alone if she stayed still. "What are we to do?" they said. "Run for the police," suggested one. "Call the fire brigade." "Fetch Pipi Longstocking," said Pipi, and stepped forward. She crouched down a few yards from the tiger, calling out to him, "Puss! Puss! Puss!" The tiger gave a dreadful growl and showed his fearful teeth. Pipi raised a warning finger. "If you bite me, I'll bite you, and no mistake," she said. The tiger leapt straight at her. "What's the matter with you? Can't you take a joke?" said Pipi, flinging him away from her. With a growling roar which made everyone shiver all over, the tiger threw himself again at Pipi. It was evident that he meant to break her neck this time. "Have it your own way," said Pipi, "but don't forget, it was you that started it." With one hand, she pressed the tiger's jaws together, and then she carried him tenderly in her arms back to the cage, while she hummed a little tune. "I love little pussy, her coat is so warm." For the second time, everyone heaved a sigh of relief. The little girl who had squashed herself into the corner ran to her mother crying that she never wanted to go to a menagerie again. The tiger had torn the hem of Pipi's dress. Pipi looked at the torn bits and said, "Has anyone got a pair of scissors?" Mademoiselle Paula had a pair. She was not cross with Pipi anymore. "Here you are, you brave little girl," she said, handing Pipi the scissors. Pipi promptly cut the dress off short, well above the knees. "Good," she said. "Now I look even better with my dress cut low at the top and high at the bottom. No one could possibly look twice as elegant." She walked in such an elegant way that her knees knocked together at each step. "Delightful," she said as she walked along. You would expect that things would have become quieter by this time, but fair days are never really quiet, and this day was no exception. In the town there was a ruffian who was very strong. All the children were afraid of him, and not only the children for that matter, everyone was frightened of him. Even the police liked to keep out of the way when Laban the ruffian was on the warpath. He was not angry always, but only when he had been drinking beer. He had been doing so on that market day. He rolled along the high street, shouting and roaring and hitting out with his dreadful arms. "Get out of my way," he shouted. "Here comes Laban." People pressed anxiously against the walls of the houses, and many of the children wept with fright. The police were nowhere to be seen. By degrees, Laban made his way to the toll gate. He was a horrible sight, with long black hair hanging over his forehead, a big red nose, and a yellow tooth sticking out of his mouth. The people who were gathered down by the toll gate thought he looked more horrible than the tiger. A little old man stood at a stall selling sausages. Laban stalked up to him, banged his fist down on the counter and shouted, "Give me a sausage and be quick about it." "That'll be threepence," the man said politely. "So you expect me to pay for it too?" said Laban. "You should be ashamed of yourself when you've got the chance to sell to a fine gentleman like me, you old blockhead. Hand over another sausage." The old man said he would rather have the money first for the sausage that Laban had already had. Laban seized the old man and shook him by the ear. "Give me another sausage," he ordered. "Quick!" The old man did not dare to disobey, but the people round could not help muttering disapprovingly. One of them was even brave enough to say, "It's a shame treating a poor old man like that." Laban turned round. He looked them over with bloodshot eyes. "Did someone open his mouth?" The people became frightened and started to go away. "Stay where you are," bawled Laban. "If anyone moves, I'll beat him to a jelly. Stay where you are," I said, "because now Laban is going to show you a thing or two." He seized a handful of sausages and started to play ball with them. He threw the sausages in the air and caught some of them with his hands, but dropped many of them on the ground. The poor old sausage man nearly wept. At that moment, a small figure came forward out of the crowd. Pipi stopped immediately in front of Laban. "And whose little boy might this be?" she said quietly. And what has his mother to say to him about flinging his breakfast around? Laban uttered a terrible roar. Didn't I tell you to stay where you are, all of you, he shouted. Do you always turn on the radio full blast? Asked Pipi. Laban raised a threatening fist, shouting, Brat! Do I have to mash you into pulp to make you quiet? Pipi stood with her hands on her hips, watching him with interest. Now, what exactly was it you did with those sausages, she said. Was this it? Throwing Laban high up in the air, she played ball with him for a minute or two. People cheered loudly, and the old sausage man clapped his small wrinkled hands and smiled. When Pipi had finished, it was a very frightened Laban who sat on the ground looking about him, dazed. I think it's about time he went home, said Pipi. Laban had no objection to this. But first, there's a number of sausages to pay for, said Pipi. Laban got up and paid for 18 sausages. Then he left without saying another word. He never behaved in quite such a bullying fashion again. 3 cheers for Pipi, shouted the crowd. Hooray for Pipi, said Tommy and Annika. We don't need a policeman in this town, said one, so long as we have Pipi Longstocking. No, we don't, said another. She takes care of tigers and ruffians. Of course, there must be a policeman, said Pipi. Someone has to see that all the bicycles are wrongly parked properly. Oh, Pipi, you're wonderful, said Annika, as the children marched home from the fair. Oh, yes, delightful, said Pipi. She held up her skirt, which already ended halfway up her legs. Absolutely delightful. And that's where I'm leaving it.